Good afternoon, Michael Malice here. Let that be your welcome for the next hour. We have with us a special guest. I've been waiting years to get her on the show. Sharyl Attkisson. Her new book is entitled Follow the Science. You've written several others as well. I'm really excited to talk to you about this book, which is out this week, because I feel like what has happened during COVID and as a consequence of this is being memory holed very intentionally. And there's a lot of very malevolent people who would rather that the population kind of forget what had been done and have people suffer no consequences as a result of that. So I'm very curious to discuss this with you, and I have a signed copy. But before we
Yes.
get into that, I have to ask you something that's a slightly personal question. Don't worry.
Go
When
ahead.
friends of mine have kids, a boy, I always tell them that their name should name their son Nichol or David. Nichol with an N, David with a B. And your parents did that to you because every single time you check into a hotel, you have to say Cheryl with an A, and then they put the A
Yes.
before the L, or they put it at the beginning, or they just
How
get
do you know
flummoxed.
that? It's so true.
Well, because I just know how these people, and then Attkisson doesn't have an N, so every single time you know it's going to happen when you check into a hotel. Am I correct?
It's so true. Yes. I blame my husband for the last name, my parents for the first name.
Have you ever sat them down and been like, "Mom," or then you have to, then they have to, then they'll put the C for Cheryl, right?
Right. I don't get it. I asked my mom, she said my dad wanted that. My dad's not around to ask why, but
Okay, so yeah, every single time.
my sister's name, one of them is Star, but that is a family last name, so that makes some sense.
Okay, okay, cool. So before we get into the specifics of the book, you've spent decades in corporate journalism, and there's a lot of talk in like right of center circles about what the political environment and cultural environment is in these rooms, right? Some people think it's just, hardcore like Marxist, others think it's just people who are just culturally left but don't really identify as left. Can you, from your years of experience, give people an idea of what those kind of the thinking process is in these spaces?
In local news years ago, I didn't know anybody's politics were. At CNN, I didn't know what most people's politics were. I worked there from 90 to 93, and we were down the middle. Ted Turner probably would have freaked out if anybody had given their opinion as an anchor on the air about stuff. That's just not what we did. CBS, I first started to understand this culture. The Republicans had just won Congress in, I want to say, was it 94?
It was
Some
94 for the first time in 40 years. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm not a political reporter. I don't pay attention. I don't care normally. And they were walking around the newsroom when I was anchoring the overnights. All I noticed, everybody was depressed, and I remember saying, "What's wrong?" And someone said, "Didn't you hear we lost the election?" I'm like,
Right.
"We?" Honest to God, I was just like, "What do they mean by we?" And then I realized they meant we, the Democrats. I was stunned that they were just openly saying these things. Not that you have to make it secret. I just hadn't heard people talk about politics like that. At CBS in Washington, where I was an investigative correspondent, I mostly have worked at places that had liberal owners and liberal bosses who were very fair and wanted good journalism wherever it went. So I did investigations that probably didn't reflect well on the Bush administration sometimes, and same with the Obama administration, until about early 2000s when pharma started interfering with our stories, and around 2008 with Obama as president, when politics started entering our stories. There was dramatic change into this thing that we see now, this monster that we call the news that is no longer the news. But there was a drastic shift. I don't know what today's newsrooms are like. I've been on my independent show that I run for 10 years, starting our 10th season. Our newsroom is a normal newsroom, more like I was always used to, with a lot of former network people in it that work on my program. I don't know what today's newsrooms are like, but I imagine it's become a different animal than what I was used to.
Um, yeah, I don't know if you remember this, but Dan Rather, who I believe was the CBS anchor at the time, said on air that the American people have thrown a temper tantrum tonight. That was his characterization of the election. And it's really kind of interesting that, ostensibly there's a lot of talk in certain circles about democracy and, both sides have their issues and put them out. And then America's kind of reached their own conclusion. And this is the first time, again, Republicans had Congress in 40 years, and they couldn't abide that happening even once. So it was, I remember that vividly at the time because it was a bit of a surprise. And for those people who are younger than us, the Speaker of the House lost his seat, which is something that hadn't happened since the Civil War, Tom Foley of Washington. So it was really a kind of historic night.
Well, my MO is always I'm more comfortable on the outside. I didn't join the PTA when my daughter was little. I did some oversight on the PTA and I helped the schools, but not through the system. That's kind of me for whatever reason. And in the newsrooms, when I would see sometimes sentiment so openly fall on one side of things, not just political issues, but others, without what I thought would be more of a freewheeling, open, journalistic sounding kind of dialogue, I would take opposing viewpoints and throw them out there just to kind of be audacious or mix things up or make people think about what they were saying. And I don't think that was always well accepted. I think
Yeah.
people really wanted you to be in, if you were going to express anything, they wanted you to be in line with the groupthink. And I think I'm just so surprised at how much groupthink there was at the networks.
There's a reporter who just did a piece on Vanity Fair. I want to pull it up because it was so kind of um, egregious in its mental gymnastics, and I want to talk to you about your own personal experiences in recent years. Give me 1 second. I want to get the exact headline here. Where's the Simons? Where is this? Man, I tweet a lot, way too much. Um, I should get a job. Sorry. He, man, this guy needs
I
a
do the
life.
same thing looking for a tweet. I'm like, well,
Here we
I
go. I found it. So this is from Vanity Fair. This his name is Joel Simon. He's the founding director of the Journalism Protection Initiative, something which sounds benign and something I would support. And he said, in his first term, Trump tried and largely failed to stifle press freedom and put journalists in jail. He might succeed the second time around. My latest for Vanity Fair. Now, it's kind of amazing where it's just like, well, he didn't do anything, but the second time it's really going to happen. But and I can even wrap my head around that perspective, but there is zero or close to zero acknowledgement or hand wringing about how the Obama administration targeted journalists. I think a lot of conservatives think the press and the Obama administration were like hand in glove, and in certain cases they were. But in many other instances, he did his people did really horrific things, and this is something you just wrote about and have been experiencing. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
I mean, Len Downey wrote a really authoritative piece about, as did others, all the things that happened under the Obama administration that were so offensive to journalism that are largely forgotten today. Nothing like anything I experienced anyway under the Trump administration. But one of the things that happened to me at CBS News while I was investigative reporting, the government was spying on me. And this was only unearthed that the forensics showed this evidence in my computer because I got a tip off from people working in the intelligence agencies. I would not have recognized this myself. Our normal spyware, programs didn't turn this up. And only through extensive forensics over a period of time have we uncovered more and more about what the government did. But what's remarkable is not, Michael, that they did that to me. That the first thing I told my bureau chief when we learned this was, I can't be the only one. I
Yeah, yeah,
surely was. Yeah, I was at the top, maybe I was one of the few prominent reporters at the time covering certain issues the Obama administration and pharma, quite frankly, would have wanted to be clued in on or control or, get into my computer about. But so were other reporters too. And I'm sure in retrospect, as one federal agent testified, this was happening to hundreds of people, what they did to me. I'm sure there were many that this was happening to and is today simply because to this moment, nobody's still been held accountable. My lawsuit's still going on. It's not going to go anywhere because I've learned how the courts are stacked against everything. Department of Justice won't apologize and, move on. They're just defending to the bitter end. But we do have one federal agent that we have a clerk's default against. I think it's the first win in a case of government spying ever in court that we know of. And lo and behold, before we can get to damages trial on this, not that he has any money, but it's a symbolic thing. He
sure, yeah.
disappeared. He's supposedly dead, and nobody knows where to find him or how he died. So I think that's just so he can't turn over more information about what we wanted to know is, of course, who higher up We wanted the evidence as to who paid him and the others that he talked
Right.
about who did this. We can never get to that now because suddenly he's gone, poof, So you get a win, but you don't really get a win when it comes to fighting the government.
But let's talk a bit about on a personal level because I was born in the Soviet Union. I came here when I was like 2 years old, and things like this are very reminiscent to me about the KGB and like secret police. The idea of the government spying on its own. Now, I could even wrap my head around if you were, let's say, some kind of narcotics dealer, or you're talking to to Putin, or you're talking to China, like, okay, what's this lady up to? Like, we got to make sure she's not funneling information. I could wrap my head around that, but there was no question on the table that you are a journalist, investigating the state, holding those powerful accountable. You weren't accused of being on the take. You weren't accused of some kind of felonies. So, on a personal level, um, how did you feel when you had like that proof that, okay, I'm not, like, it's, just because they're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. What's that feel like when your sense of they're watching me is actually validated? What do you do with that information?
Well, I never suspected they were doing it. So when people clued me
Okay.
in that it might be happening, when a friend connected to intelligence got a contact with intelligence to do the initial forensics exam, and when it came back, as he said, positive, first of all, he's a former, the guy that helped me, FBI unit chief and an attorney, he was bowled over. He called me and said, I'm not going to talk to you on your phones anymore. We had to meet in person. And then the person who examined it was supposedly bowled over. This was a third source that I never met. But I got a report that showed the extent of what they've been doing in my computers before I had my own forensics confirming all of this. And I guess my first thought as a journalist was like, I've got like
Oh,
evidence.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
hard
yeah.
evidence what we got through forensics. And my forensics expert said, it's like a fingerprint, the government intrusions and the IP addresses we found in my computers. There's no doubt about it. I thought from that point on, it's a given. Okay. You prove the government was in your computer. They apologize. They fire whoever was responsible. But no, they just fight. They
Right.
literally, I guess it was naive to think once you have the proof, that's all you need. But no, you have to get to court, and it's impossible to get to court. Not only have I spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, I'll never see a penny of that back, and through the good graces of an attorney who's helping me, who thinks this is one of the worst cases he said he ever saw in his career of an offense against a journalist. But this is being done for the symbolic effort because I knew it would happen to more people, as it happened to Trump years later. Like, I think if the government had taken care of business when this happened to me and some other journalists, they wouldn't have been free to do it, continue doing it years later. And I think even today, why would they have stopped when no one's been
Right.
held accountable for the things that they've done?
Folks, Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs, and even gives you tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workouts, sleep, and even stress management. Here's how it works. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism, whether you're burning mostly carbs or fats. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Your metabolism is your body's engine. It's how your body turns the food you eat into the fuel that keeps you going. And because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does, optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits like weight management, improved energy, better fitness results, better sleep, so on and so forth. And Lumen gives you those recommendations to improve your metabolic health. If you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/malice to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/malice to get 15% off your purchase. I use it. I think it's a fun device to have. Gives me information about my body. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. Let's get back to the show. So when you heard that this clerk, how did you learn that this clerk who you won the victory against had vanished? Like, how did you come to that information? What was your reaction?
Well, it's called a clerk's default, but he was an ex contractor in the
Okay.
Baltimore field office of the U.S. Attorney under Rod Rosenstein. And he had a lot of information. We sued him, even though he's maybe in a way a whistleblower, but not a well intentioned whistleblower. He was telling on people he was mad at that he had worked with on these covert operations. One of the people he'd worked with on this operation, he said, was a former Secret Service agent that we also sued. who was in prison at the time for other corruption, an ex-Secret Service agent. So the judge dismissed the case against him recently, saying, literally, well, he said he didn't do it. And it blows me away what can happen to an average citizen in court, that the guy just says he didn't do it and the judge writes into the order, he said he didn't do it. So therefore
Wait, hold
there's
on.
no
I got
case.
to interrupt you because you're not an average citizen. You're a high profile citizen. So there would ostensibly would be a cost in terms of, okay, if we're going to be this egregious, this woman is in a position to blow this story up. And they still did it.
Yeah. The first judge that heard the first case I tried to bring, this has been a reiteration, we're on our last gasp. She said in open court to the Department of Justice, this is a credible, world known journalist. This case is not going away. She told DOJ
Yeah.
because they were trying to dismiss it. She said that twice in the hearing. And would you believe it or not, within 2 months, the case went away with no chance for us to fight it or have a hearing. She just dismissed it. And this has been the story that I've learned as over the 10 years that I've been trying to get accountability for this. It's really quite stunning. But I know average citizens go through this every day when the government
Yes.
either accuses them of something or when they try to get accountability. Look at poor Carter Page. He was the Trump campaign associate that was undoubtedly, this has been an admission, illegally spied upon by FBI, including a lawyer at the FBI who broke the law to help get one of the wiretaps. To this day, they haven't apologized or made restitution to the guy. And there's no doubt about publicly what happened to him. So it's just impossible to get accountability with today's Soviet like, I will say, structure where our federal agencies and officials, they don't think they're accountable to us. They think they lord over us. They're a
They're
separate
right.
and distinct entity that tells us what to do rather than responding to us.
They're right, though.
They
Like
are.
they're right. They're functionally correct. I had dinner once, not through choice. Ruben invited his friend with someone who was ex CIA or ex FBI, and he was sick of the corruption. He says these agencies need reform. I don't remember which one it was, and he said what we used to do is, like, if not he, maybe somebody else wanted to read their ex girlfriend's Gmail, well, that's illegal, but they can call their contact in France and be like, hey, give me her Gmail. So then you're getting it secondarily, and the French person can do the same. And he's just telling me this brazenly, and I'm like, this is how the French Revolution happens. Just it's there's no possibility the person doing this has any sort of patriotism or crime in mind. They're just grossly abusing their power just because they're curious over someone they had a relationship with. It's just so removed from any sort of presentation in the media we have of what these agencies are like, and they're love the flag and they want to do a good job. And to your point, you would think if there's the slightest bit of that in these agencies, they'd be like, you know what, this made us look bad. We have to regain the public's trust. We're not going to stop till this is weeded out and it's put a stop to. And as you said again, they completely stonewalled. So, but again, how did you find out that this person vanished? Like, and what was your reaction?
I can't remember who sent me the information because we had no idea. Someone sent me, or I ran across an obituary for him.
Okay.
And the obituary gives no detail, and nobody that I posted on there to see if anybody knew how he supposedly died. My attorney and his investigator, who used to work for the FBI, dug into that, couldn't get any information. We filed some papers with the court regarding that and some other stuff. Court didn't respond. The last thing he had said in writing, or one of the last things he'd said to the court, was that he wasn't fighting my case because he wanted to expose what had been done. Again, he had sort of an axe to grind against some of the people he worked
Yeah.
with. They hire, this is from what I've learned, unsavory characters to do these unsavory jobs, like the Secret
Right.
Service agent that was convicted on other corruption charges. The government, when it does this dirty work or has these dark operations, they don't use the upstanding guys that are going to talk about it later. They use certain characters. And this guy, I think there's every chance or possibility that because I had won a clerk's default against him and that we could have gotten more information from him, that he was put in a witness protection program and he is not really dead. There's every possibility of that. And as crazy as that sounds, I had turned into the court information I found about him to try to add to the credibility of our case that proved, because I found this court filing that was supposed to be redacted and wasn't, that proved he did work for Rod Rosenstein in the U.S. Attorney's Office, like he said he did in Baltimore, and that Rod Rosenstein had, I keep saying Steen, I think it's Stein, had signed a court document saying that this guy was helping the government with a secret case, and that even though this guy was in trouble with the law for something unrelated, supposedly, that he needed to be put basically in witness protection for his own good and his own safety. So we were able to establish, like he said, a firm relationship between him, Rod Rosenstein, these secretive operations that were going on. And then all of a sudden he disappears and he's supposedly dead.
Yeah, it's also interesting because we were so conditioned as Americans that this sort of thing is crazy, this could never happen. Or then when you look at it happening in the past, well, that was then. It's like, okay, like if you think this maybe happened in the 60s or 70s, at what point did it stop and what was the change? And their just eyes go blank. Because I think
Thank
there's
you.
this
That's exactly what I've said to people. I'm like, they talk about J. Edgar Hoover. Do you think when all the revelations were made about the dirty stuff that J. Edgar Hoover did as FBI director, that someone took all the stuff he gathered and threw it away or burned it? Like,
right?
where do you
Yeah.
think that stuff is today? The blackmail material and all the information he'd gathered.
But not only that, the culture. Right? Like, when Colonel Sanders died, it's not like KFC started, selling cars. Like, they kept up his legacy, and because if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So
Right.
any organization that has been around at this point for, over a century that has a certain MO, unless there's some kind of external or internal massive force to reorient it, is going to maintain that status quo. And frankly, any powerful organization, just psychologically speaking, is going to do what is necessary to maintain its power. It's just human nature. So if they're in a position to kind of, hold presidents and let alone senators and congress people, make them bend the knee, why would anyone voluntarily give up that power, especially if you think you're the good guys?
And they've become more audacious. I have made lists
Yeah.
that I published on my website over time of the violations that we know about, and that's probably the teeniest fraction of what's actually occurred. But as of 15 years ago, there were incidents that leaked out where they were spying on members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. That used to be considered so untouchable that if that had ever been done or gotten out, it would be such a scandal. They spied on staff members with Congress, looking at their records, intimidating them because some staff members were thought to be talking to whistleblowers. I mean, there is a long record that is growing and building of the liberties that they've taken as they have secretly, meaning the CIA, NSA, and so on, as they've secretly granted themselves greater authority to look into Americans' personal records, which was something, again, that used to be off limits unless you were accused of some kind of specific crime. Now they have all different ways they can afford themselves to talk, to look into Michael Malice, for example. There's something called two hop rule. I think it was a three hop rule for a while. That if I'll use a real life theoretical example, if they wanted to listen to Donald Trump, wiretap him, as I think they did, but they didn't want to go to the court with that request because the court would go, that sounds pretty political. You have to have some goods. They can find anybody around Donald Trump that might communicate with him or with someone else who would communicate with him two hops away. And if they can get a warrant against that person, in this case, Carter Page, because Carter Page had visited Russia as a businessman, as many Americans were encouraged to do after the Soviet Union fell, to help develop businesses. But it looks suspicious now because we're all suspicious of Russia. So Carter Page visited, so we'll get a wiretap against Carter Page. And they're legally entitled, under the rules they made for themselves, to listen in on all his stuff and to look at everything, and also that of everybody he communicates with, and also everybody that those people
That they,
communicate
yeah.
with. So even though Carter Page says he never met or talked to or emailed Donald Trump, they had access to Donald Trump's stuff. People don't talk about that a lot, by wiretapping Carter Page. So these
and
are the
here,
things they
here's
allow themselves to do.
and here's an example. If anyone out there doubts that me and Cheryl are wearing tinfoil hats, on President Obama wiretapped Angela Merkel's cell phone, who was the prime minister of Germany, or I forget title, chancellor, whatever it is, and it became a huge public scandal. Germany's obviously a close ally of ours. It's not like there was any possibility of us going to war or whatever. And he's basically like, "Oops, sorry." And like there was not a thing like, wait a minute, hold on, like this is the sort of thing that really is bad for international relations. It's gonna, like we should take a step back if this. No, there's just. And are you surprised? And I would love to hear your hypothesis as to why it seems like there is an extreme lack of intellectual curiosity among the press as to anything that has to do in this area. Do you think it's just that because they're playing for the same team? Do you think they're personally scared? Like, what's your opinion as to why that's the case?
Well, I'll preface it by saying that when this happened to me with the government intrusions being forensically confirmed, I went to investigative reporters conference around that time, and top executives with three other networks told me they thought they were also being spied on, and I'm sure that was true. You can
Wow.
imagine that the Obama administration would want to be monitoring all the things that the news agencies were coming up with and what whistleblowers they might be talking to inside the government and so on. But nobody ever talked about that publicly. And part of that is a little bit of fear. What will happen to me if I speak of it and they are looking at my stuff? Part of it, I think, is the culture has been so infiltrated in the past 20 years by outside interests. It used to be that political and corporate interests knew how to try to get us to report what they want or stop reporting. Now they work in the newsrooms. They are one and the same. They've been hired as executives or editorial personnel. So we've made a big transformation, or we've had a transformation made in the news. They're no longer, in many cases, independent news organizations with independent leaders. They are propagandists, which explains why when they get a piece of news so wrong, like the New York Times does not infrequently now and has the past few years, those reporters aren't held to account. It's
Right.
like they didn't even do it. There's hardly any acknowledgement of it because they accomplished the goal. They didn't really do anything wrong in the eyes of the people that want those narratives out. They got the job done. So they actually get lauded and promoted. Look at Maggie Haberman and other people who've been disgraced on many fronts, and yet were continued to be promoted and given assignments and treated as if their reporting was good.
Hey, folks, Michael Malice here. You might know me as a Twitter troll, terrible author, insufferable podcaster, but I'm also an underwear model, and the underwear that I model and wear every day is Sheath underwear. If you go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice, you get 20% off and you can be inside my pants. Why I love Sheath is they have special dual pouch technology for both parts of your male anatomy. It sounds weird. The first time I tried them on, I'm like, what is this? And now I literally wear them every day. The great thing about Sheath, it was developed by an Iraq war veteran. And overseas, it gets really, really hot. And Bobby decided, all right, what can I do to make sure I'm not suffering here in this heat? And thanks to his research, you can be comfortable in the comfort of your own home. It's great for cold weather. It's great for hot weather. It keeps you secure and comfortable. And there's something really exciting about going on a job interview, going on a date, doing a podcast, knowing that your underwear has you in its grip, nice and secure and comfortable. Go to sheathunderwear.com, use promo code Malice. You get 20% off, and you can get one step closer to looking as much like a hunk as myself. Let's get back to the show. I wanted to shift tracks to your book because I think it was shocking how well the propaganda won over people in America and worldwide. I think many people remember in 2012 when you had Occupy and Let's March Against Monsanto, and then a decade later, the pharma companies are basically, Christ come down from the cross and can do no wrong. And to even question them is to support, genocide of the elderly, and so on and so forth. I had Dr. Drew as a guest on my show, and he's a medical doctor, not a Jill Biden doctor. And he was asking basic medical questions about the procedures. And he had randos on Twitter basically tell him, sit down and shut up. You know what you're talking about. And he's like, I went to medical school. Like, you're not in a position to tell me. I'm not even saying anything. I'm just asking questions about how are these procedures derived? Like, what's your basis for making these recommendations? I'm curious as to what kind of spawned your idea to write this book about follow the science?
Well, HarperCollins asked me initially to write a book about all the COVID missteps and fraud and corruption. And we agreed after I looked at it a little bit that been well done and being well done by other people, including the Robert F. Kennedy book on Dr. Fauci. I said, what about looking at the bigger issue? There are some important COVID lessons in the book, but it's more about this complex that involves and the details of the connections between media, big pharma,
Yeah.
politics, and the medical establishment. How doctors are taught in med school from a from a Merck written textbook. It's called the Merck Manual, believe it or not. And what that manual that doctors learn from leaves out and the false information that's in there is shocking. I went through some specific cases. How doctors are taught after the fact in their continuing medical education classes about things like what truths do we know now about COVID vaccine and injuries in kids, how they're being taught false and missing information by instructors in these classes who introduce themselves by their academic and professional titles, but as I learned, work for dozens of vaccine makers, and the doctors aren't critically thinking enough. They should know. In one case, a doctor who's close to me was talking about attending a seminar that reflected so well upon this particular medicine that I knew was controversial. And I said, your presenter works for that drug company. He said, well, no, I don't think so. He works for so and so, and this is this academic institution. And he looked into it and he called me back within an hour and said, you're right. So these continuing education classes are being taught by people being paid by the drug companies. The doctors are learning bad information from med school all the way through their professional educations afterwards. And I think that's shocking and explains a lot.
Yeah, that does make, because I don't believe, which I think some people who I would consider tinfoil hats, that like all the doctors of America just inherently became corrupt overnight. I don't think most people go through medical school with some sort of political agenda one way or another. But it was interesting when you hear them all kind of universally say things like, for example, that hormones, puberty can be stopped, but you could just turn it back on whenever you want. And it's just like look at gymnasts, look at kids who are like malnourished. It's not a thing, but they act as if it is. And you're like, why are they all kind of saying universally the same thing? And this kind of would explain how the this coherent message is universally expressed. That's the channel.
Yes, and the independent doctors, many mainstream doctors who've now broken off on their own because of their disgust over what happened in COVID, they were asking rational questions and doing
Yeah.
things like you say, thinking independently and raising common sense questions about ordinary things that people should be asking. But the doctors, I've had doctors who did not raise a fuss during COVID tell me since then, including a doctor that I visited with my husband, and he said, we all were just horrified, but we couldn't say anything. And again, that's shocking. The kind of personality that falls in line and knows better. And yet, I guess, I understand their livelihood depends on it. You have to be ready to walk away, as many doctors did, from their lucrative jobs and their careers and be spanked and smeared and maybe even have your licenses pulled. I guess that's a lot to ask when they see that's
Yeah.
happening to other people. But additionally, by and large, a friend of mine who pointed this out about a relative who is a doctor. There are many fine doctors. I've interviewed a lot of them, but she said, by and large, a lot of them are very well educated sheep. And I don't know why that is, but I do think it starts in med school with sort of the narratives they're taught and how they're basically taught to practice medicine and what they say to patients and how they consider things. It kind of sends them down this funnel where that's how they act and they're not doing their independent thinking.
What are some of these kind of narratives or techniques that are being taught to them in medical school that you've learned about?
Well, when I looked up, for example, a Merck medicine, the HPV Gardasil vaccine, which has been very controversial. And in fact, the co-inventor on that vaccine became a whistleblower and said she was concerned about it, that she thought Merck was over promoting it, and that it may be more dangerous than the disease it purports to prevent, if it even works. Is there anything in the book about that? No, they don't
Right.
teach anything about their own scandals, about questions, about side effects. And then furthermore, when you look and see what it says are the side effects of the vaccine. So if you look at the FDA approved label, every medicine has side effects. This vaccine has really a daunting list of them, dozens and dozens of serious, all kinds of adverse events it can cause. What does the Merck manual say? There are no serious adverse events with this vaccine. Think about that.
Oh, wow.
Doctors are not
Wow.
being told to monitor or ask questions when people take a medicine as to what's happened to them since. They're not being told to then report this to the federal database that is supposed to look for patterns when people have illnesses that arise to see if medicines and vaccines are causing these things. So the whole culture from med school starts with not teaching them to look at these things, and kind of they start to poo poo when patients come in and try to talk to them about this stuff. They're getting assigned a regimen of pills and treatments rather than the doctor being taught or told to look for root cause issues. There are now root cause doctors and functional medicine doctors who are doing this sort of thing, and that's growing and growing. But why don't your regular doctors do that? And that's also influenced, Michael, by the insurance system, which is influenced by these same powerful forces that doesn't give them the time, doesn't reward them for looking at root causes. They want them to be prescribed medicine and treatments. So it's just this giant complex that's been built up to the benefit of this, I don't know, this information juggernaut that we're talking about.
Yeah, I remember vividly during, the COVID era, and, whenever I hear a point of view I disagree with, I try to, like, go inside that framework and, like, okay, if this what would need to be true for this to follow? And, there were people being very strong and kids need to be vaccinated, right? And there was no dispute the vaccine lasts 6 months or, you need boosters every 6 months, and that also it's non-fatal for kids. It's just not happening, especially at a very young age. And I'm sitting there, I'm like saying, according to your logic, not crazy me, you're going to force kids to get a shot, which you were a kid, I was a kid, everyone was a kid. Kids don't love needles. And no kid does. Every 6 months in perpetuity for no consequence. And that was literally their argument. The other point I always make to people who aren't political, I go, Republican, Democrat, who cares? Was social distancing efficacious in preventing the spread of COVID? And if it was, why didn't they bring it back? And if it wasn't, why did we do it to begin with? So things like this just don't add up without having any kind of political perspective. But Jimmy Dore, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's another podcaster. He had this whole bit about they successfully made it seem that reading is for stupid people. It's like you did your own research. What are you, one of those readers? What kind of idiot are you? We know what the science is. And I mean, this kind of speaks to your title about Follow the Science. Can you talk a bit about that kind of campaign to encourage people to just smile and nod, especially about things that are so extremely personal as health?
Well, this is a very sophisticated, perhaps the most successful propaganda campaign of our time, not just about
Yeah.
COVID, but about medical issues in general. And remember, these have been devised by very well informed, well funded groups. We're talking about nonprofits and LLCs and global law firms that work for this industry that do their research and they understand the buzzwords to use, the
Yeah.
human psychology, how to prey upon people so that they will keep their mouths shut if they dissent or maybe question themselves when they're asking the most rational, logical questions, but be made to think that they're not logical questions. And I can only tell you that these are campaigns that have been well thought out and applied with the assistance of government and media and your local doctor. So they're very hard to break through. When you do your internet searching and people are trying to do due diligence, they made it where the stuff that they don't want you to read won't show up or will show up as discredited. It's very hard for the average person to break through what's true and what's not. And I've I've tried to give some tools to do that because it's possible. And unfortunately, it takes a little bit of work, but not as much as you might think to start to become familiar with the narratives and the themes. One huge piece of advice I give that's unfortunately true, when everyone seems to be on the same page, you're talking about government and the news reports, and a lot of times using the same language and verbiage, which is not natural that they would be, and they're all saying the same thing, that should make you consider that the opposite may be true in today's environment. Your first question should be to yourself, who wants me to believe this and why? So it's not by chance that everybody came to the same conclusion. Independent news organizations don't do that. They would use different words. They would have different people on to interview.
Right.
When they're all on the same page, marching to the same tune, you need to wonder who's pulling strings and organizing this effort and why.
Yeah, that is really the tell when they use the same verbiage. And I think on social media, people have caught on to that tactic. I just saw that not that long ago. There was a montage of all the headlines referring to Kamala Harris's campaign of joy, and it's like when has a very specific word that can't be coincidence. Someone's,
Totally.
there's some sort
It's
of
not.
coordination or independent. Like, okay, we're all got to get on the same page here. Trust the science is another one. Like these are little quasi hypnotic techniques to short circuit independent thought and just basically not look at the subject and just obey.
A very simple example that people can relate to that I wrote of in the past. There were some documents that were revealed through the WikiLeaks leak of Democratic National Committee documents and through some other Freedom of Information requests. And one of the specific cases it revealed was reporters were trying to get an advance copy of then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's speech, and she was going to be running for president. They were trying to promote her. So they're negotiating in a way they don't friendly negotiate with the Republicans, but they're negotiating with her. Oh, we want Hillary's advance copy of her speech. We'll do a great story on it. And this person, the Hillary representative, was dictating terms. Among the terms, there were several of them. They said, you must refer to her speech as muscular, which is kind of a weird thing to call a speech, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
lo and behold, you can find the resulting articles. More than one journalist called her speech muscular, a weird word you wouldn't normally use in a speech. And now they're more than one is doing it. One of them came up with a little cute cartoon of Hillary looking muscular. She was trying at the time, having obviously not served in the military, but to show that she had military heft. She was running against Obama at the time, if I remember correctly. So I'm getting my timeline mixed up, but she was trying to prove that she had some military heft having not served in the military. So now they're calling her muscular. The journalists agreed to the terms. And part of the term was, you must not tell anybody we have this agreement. So these things are
Wow.
happening behind the scenes all the time, probably.
Eh,
And we just don't know
well,
about them.
and a more shameless one is when she was running for Senate in New York in 2000, a state she had no roots in whatsoever. She went on David Letterman, and he gave her a softball interview, and he's like, "Oh, let me have a quiz." And he's like, "What's the state bird? What's the state slogan?" And she's like, "Oh, it's this, it's that." And this had all been. They both admitted it. This had all been prepared. She had the questions ahead of time, but it made it look like I'm a New Yorker. I know what the state bird is. It made it look like she was showing her bona fides about being a New Yorker, and it was completely phony. And I know the average person thinks things like that don't happen because it's so removed from how like a normal person would operate that it never enters their head. That they're like, okay, maybe he gave her some hints, but they wouldn't come on. And when at a certain point, people have to realize this stuff. Why wouldn't powerful people and powerful companies coordinate to maintain their power and profits? There's no incentive for them not to do so.
Well, there's another example, and maybe after we finish this, I will put this back on my homepage at SharylAttkisson.com. People will love this. I wrote up all
Wait,
these
tell
media
people how to
collusion.
spell that. Here, this is how it's spelled, by the way, because
Yeah,
no one
if you
else knows how to
misspell it,
spell
it
it.
should still come up because it knows,
Okay.
it knows my name misspelled. But yeah, SharylAttkisson.com. I'll try to put on the homepage this list of these media collusion examples. There's another great one where a reporter from Politico was trying to get an interview, a big exclusive with Chelsea Clinton. Who cares? But this is what passes for scoops and exclusives where they get pats on the back for it. And he was writing to the handlers for Chelsea Clinton, we will come up with a list of pre-agreed upon questions. Like I'll ask you only what you want. She'll know what's coming, and you can break news on any topic. Like there were all these things he was offering, and it was going to look like they didn't agree to the interview, which is kind of funny, but it was designed to look like he had an honest interview when
Right.
actually it was simply a pre-designated written presentation. It would have been by Chelsea Clinton of something the Clintons wanted her to talk about in the guise of what looked like a format of a real interview that was never going to be a real interview. So
Yeah.
this stuff happens quite often, I think.
And I could even wrap my head if this was someone like Castro or some major world leader who doesn't talk to the West, it's like, all right, at least I'm getting FaceTime with this guy, so maybe I could be able to sneak one in. This is Chelsea Clinton. This isn't even a Kardashian. Like, my God, like
I would argue if
that's what I
you're
think.
gonna totally. If you're gonna do that, and I if there's a situation like you said, or even with Chelsea, that's okay, but you say at the top as the reporter, "Look, I couldn't get an interview with her. I agreed to talk about what she wanted to talk about." And that's actually okay with me. I mean, maybe some people would debate that point, but I think disclosure of what you're doing is fine. It's where they all then say, we're not going to tell anybody that we have these secret rules and secret deals. That's where it's so problematic.
It was also, I remember, a friend of mine was a big former New York City DJ, like a talk show, and they would have celebrities come in, and it'd be like, let's suppose Hugh Grant in the middle of that scandal, and it's like, all right, Hugh doesn't want to talk about getting caught with a prostitute, but he really wants to talk about his new movie, and it's like, yeah, well, I don't want to talk about his new movie, like that's, and then you have to do this kind of interview with this elephant in the room. And everyone at home is like, why aren't you asking about, like, front page in New York Post, he got caught with a prostitute? So this is not only just in politics, it's just pervasive, and it's just amazing how much people agree to it. And why do you think journalists are, or just even people like myself? I've never had anyone on my I've actually, what I'll tell you, I'm not going to say the person's name. There was someone who I was extremely excited to have on the show, and before it happened, they go, okay, the focus of the interview is going to be about this product. And I said, okay, cancel it. I just said immediately cancel it. I'm like, I'm not taking notes. Podcasts are free flowing. You don't know what you're going to get into. If you can't handle it, I'm not interested. And they came back and they're like, okay, as long as you cover it to some extent, you could talk whatever you want. And I was happy to cover it. If someone wants to promote their product, that makes perfect sense to me as well. So I did dig in my heels on that one.
What's up, guys? I'm Brendan Schaub. If you love everything mixed martial arts, I'm talking UFC breakdowns, UFC picks, one championship picks, Bellator, PFL, you name it, your boy breaks it all down. Tune into The Schaub Show, available every Monday wherever you listen to your podcasts. The Schaub Show. Enjoy.
Let's get back to the show. What are some of the biggest, I think what happens when people go down these rabbit holes about corruption and collusion, we're often shocked at how brazen it is and how public it is. Like, there'll be some rando New York Times story where they cover it, and it's like, how is this not bigger news? Like, so they can say they acknowledged it, but they don't really talk about it with a amount of severity that you would think it would entail. What were some of the most surprising things you learned while doing your investigation?
Well, a lot of this was learned over a period of years, and what I'm trying to do in the book is take people along on a journey, because if they just hear me talk now or they know my reporting, they think, yeah, Cheryl's just a skeptical person, so she's
Right.
broken global health stories because she's just super skeptical of everything. And I'm trying to show people I didn't start that way. My brother's a doctor, my dad's a doctor. There was a time not all that long ago when I thought doctors always have, all of them, your best interest at heart. The government wouldn't lie. The health agencies act on data. None of that is always true, but I'm using selected anecdotes and data to prove that point, to show the journey how I got where I am today, probably like other Americans, not
Yeah.
just starting out in the middle. And what I like about what my editor said when he read the book was, he said 80% of the people who are well informed won't know 90% of what's in the
Yeah.
book.
Yeah.
So even if you are a skeptic and you understand some of this stuff, I think you won't know about some of the examples that we're talking about. Another thing he said was, some of it sounds initially like unbelievable, like there'll be a statement that something happened. He said, then you turn the page and the data is there and the proof and the citations. And it's very powerful when you see it in that light, not just somebody's opinion and speculation, which is what I tried to do. I will say, like, one of the really surprising things along the way was when there were these vaccine autism cases working their way through court some years ago, and the government was pretending there was no link. They had actually settled a landmark case in secret and told the parents they couldn't talk about it, and acknowledged that the vaccines caused the child's autism. Her dad is a Johns Hopkins neurologist, and the mom is a nurse and a lawyer. So they could not call these crazy parents like they try to do when the government
Right.
defends the cases on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry. But the surprise here was years later when the expert witness for the government, who defends the Department of Justice, defends the vaccine makers against victims, vaccine victims in court, their chief witness, Dr. Andrew Zimmerman, world-renowned neurologist, came to a point where he realized vaccines can cause autism. So he's now flipping on the issue, their chief witness, and he goes and he signed a sworn affidavit to this effect. He goes to the Department of Justice and says, you should know that we can't say that vaccines don't cause autism in every instance. And here's why scientifically, here's what's now been proven. I've even treated patients like this. What happens? He says the government fires him as an expert witness instead of admitting the truth, and then continue to misrepresent his opinion in court and say that he didn't believe this. They still used his expertise, presenting the wrong position, which is disbarrable if you're an attorney and fireable, in my view, working for the Department of Justice.
Of
But of
course.
course, nobody was ever held accountable. That story, when I tell it, makes the vaccine industry and their surrogates crazy because it's so hard to refute or explain. But they will come up with every kind of fact check, and the fact checks don't say any of it's not. They don't say any of it's not true. They just try to say, well, was Dr. Zimmerman really the chief witness? Yes, he was, but let's say he's only one of the top two. Who cares? It still happened. They try to
Right. Yeah.
knock down little bits of things or knock down arguments that weren't actually said. It's a typical, fake fact check, as I call them. They try to debunk something by debunking something slightly different than what was said and leaving people with the impression something wasn't true. But I think that's a very powerful case of collusion between the vaccine industry and the government in a way that was dishonest and arguably has resulted in a lot of harm to people because the truth has been kept hidden for so long when the government knew otherwise.
And I'm stunned to learn this, to be honest. Everyone in my audience, is probably on the spectrum, given how I curate my audience. But to be more serious, the impression you would get from corporate media and most of social media is that anyone who thinks there's any kind of link between vaccines and autism is a crazy person, right? Or this is, tinfoil hat, Alex Jones, fluoride is there so that the government can read your thoughts and, water supply, so on and so forth, right? It's all piled in the same package. Now, you're not even saying that he's right. All you're saying is there is someone whose expertise you valued highly enough that he was your chosen witness, and this person did the research. He didn't go to tarot card reading. He didn't start reading his horoscope. He looked at the science, and he came to a different perspective. And instead of saying, well, here's how he got it wrong, it's like, no, this didn't happen, and he's crazy.
Yeah, and I mean, even better, this is the Department of Justice's chosen expert to defend the cases he's now on the other side on. It's sort of like the best friend of the murder suspect admitting his friend committed the murder. He was, in essence,
Yeah.
saying everything that they hoped wasn't true. And once he said that, they didn't want to hear from him. Now, there's a large body of studies and evidence that backs up what he said, and it has been built upon since that time. This was some years ago. But you're right. So I simply reported the fact of the matter, and then that will be controversialized, and the story will be pulled off of YouTube, and nothing that was said in it is even challengeable from a standpoint of accuracy. It's just something they don't want people to hear or know about.
Well, then, I mean, let's talk practicality. Like, if a parent wants their kids to go to school, they have to be vaccinated, from my understanding. Is this that certain type of vaccine? Is it just how they administer it? Like, what is a parent to do if they want to just err on the side of caution?
Well, I stopped short of giving advice because every situation is different. People should do their own
Sure.
reading and consult their doctors and so on. But there are many things, and this is what's been so confusing. Autism is simply the name we give to a group of neurological and other kinds of
Right.
disorders that have exploded. So, what we say is autism, many scientists think is actually a lot of different injuries. Some of them come with gastric problems, some of them don't have allergies and gastric problems. It's a lot of different things. But it could be, as I've learned, many different things. And unfortunately, the subsets of advocates not only work against each other sometimes, but are pitted against each other by the outside vaccine interests to confuse matters. It could be that the MMR shot and the DPT shot given so close together one's a live virus and one is not, does something to the immune system in some immune challenged children who have, let's say, mitochondrial disorders, something that you could test for, but nobody does, that interacts in some of these kids in a way that causes the brain injury. In some kids, they believe simply getting vaccinated when you still have a cold or an immune challenge. That's why they tell you don't get vaccines when you've been sick. They don't tell you why, but it can be very injurious to your body because your body may not have the right reaction. It could be that the preservatives contained in some of the adjuvants that make vaccines supposedly work, they're poisonous to some people, not everybody. When they
Right.
had a lot of thimerosal mercury in vaccines, it hasn't all been pulled out, but a lot of it has. Some children cannot shed the mercury. Most people, they say, pee and poop out little bits of mercury when you get it. But if you don't, it can be very toxic to the brain. That's just a fact. So there
That's
are
the
many
Mad
different
Hatter
things.
was because of mercury poisoning.
Absolutely, and the mercury in your fillings and so on.
Yes.
So there's a combination of factors, and then add in the complex thing that the food that we eat contains chemicals. The water that we drink contains all kinds of chemicals that can add to the immune and toxic challenges. So the formula is different for every kid. It
Mhm.
is figure outable. I mean, this could be deciphered if anybody were to try, but to get money to do the studies, most of the money comes from the government or the pharmaceutical industry. They're not going to fund them. Government works for the
Right.
pharmaceutical industry. Pharma doesn't want to know that its own products and chemicals are causing these things. They don't want you to know it. So this stuff would have to be funded by some independent mechanism that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., I think, would fully understand. And some independent doctors are doing some good work on some of this stuff because this is, I think, the root of our chronic diseases. And even as one chapter in the book says, there is I call him the frog doctor, a liberal African American Berkeley professor that 20 years ago discovered working for the chemical company that a particular chemical turns boy frogs into girl frogs. And we
Yeah.
now know from hundreds of subsequent studies it impacts all animals. There's no argument about that. The only argument is government and the chemical maker would say, well, we don't get enough in our environment when we drink our water. It's not going to be too much for us. We can handle it. There's no doubt that disrupts your hormones and your endocrine system and causes all kinds of problems. He thinks that plays a role in the gender confusion that so many people have. Why
Oh,
aren't people
wow.
asking, we have this rash in gender confusion. Yes, let's help the people that are suffering, but why isn't there more of an effort to look into potential root causes if we know there are thousands of chemicals in our environment and our food, many of which are hormone and endocrine disruptors? Wouldn't it make sense to do some research and go down these roads? And when this scientist unearthed some of this information, the stuff that the chemical company did to smear and destroy him, and some of that's been revealed through lawsuits, you'll be stunned by the tactics that they use to try to discredit researchers who come out on the wrong side of important health issues.
And to anyone skeptical about this, it's crazy to me. I talk about this all the time, how there's this no talk or very little in our discussion of these sort of issues about the effects of hormones on the mind. And ask yourself, a bodybuilder who's taking testosterone aggression, people know that, and people understand when women are pregnant, their hormones all over the place. Like, ask any woman who's ever had a kid, did the hormones affect your psychology? She'll laugh in your face. And yet somehow, if you give it not even cross gender, within the gender, give a woman estrogen when she's menopausal, it's going to have an effect on her, a positive in that regard. But if you say, okay, this chemical affects your hormones, do you think that's going to have some kind of domino effect? That's something you want to know about? People would understand, yes, but then they all also pretend, well, if this was happening, we would know. But I think that's the key to the pushback. There's this fundamental belief, quote, if this was happening, I'd know about it. I read the New York Times, I watch CNN, like
Yeah.
they wouldn't just ignore this, right? Isn't that basically the response people give to this sort of stuff?
I think a lot of times, yes. And probably I fell into that category 20 years ago before
Okay,
I was
yeah.
assigned to investigate my first medical stuff. You don't understand there's this world that exists beyond your. I didn't understand the mechanism. My kid's fully vaccinated. I've had a bazillion vaccines to travel with the military to cover my stories. I didn't know any of this. And I didn't understand the mechanism. When I used to hear things that vaccines could potentially cause, it sounded crazy. Tinfoil hat, because people
Yeah,
say
yeah.
that over and over. The mechanisms are very clear. scientifically, it turns out there's not a question about a lot of the things that can happen and that are on the warning labels. Autism is on a warning label for a vaccine that they ultimately pulled from the market. So there's a lot of science behind it. But before you understand that, it sounds crazy, but that's because you haven't, and many reporters, me guilty as well in the beginning, haven't done our research. But I try not to opine on stuff, or I don't report on things and claim to know something if I haven't had the chance to dig in, because I try to understand there may be a lot of stuff that sound wild that will prove to be true if I actually dig into the factual material. Mistake many reporters make today is they just declare stuff isn't true when they don't know better and haven't done the research, or haven't looked at the right research, and they just claim to know what's right and what's wrong.
Or they'll just talk to that one doctor who will tell them the conclusion they want to hear. And they're like, all right, I've done my due diligence. I have an authority who's going to validate my conclusion. Why would I have someone who kind of was skeptical of this conclusion have a balanced article?
So I've gone down that road of exposing when the drug companies used to, in government, refer me to independent doctors, independent sounding doctors like Dr. Paul Offit, Children's Hospital. And come to find out, he invented the vaccine he's commenting on. He's made allegedly hundreds of millions of dollars from it. He won't disclose how much, but he's being held out by most of the media as an independent doctor on vaccines, just given his opinion on how safe it all is. I think I was the first and only reporter, when they would refer me, government pharma, to interview him on so many topics, that I asked about his affiliations and would disclose them. Doesn't mean his opinion's invalid, but
Right.
surely you have to know where he's coming from. If he's defending a vaccine that you're questioning, you have to say he's the inventor, and most people don't. And I started to find out that whenever, 100% of the time, when I was referred to interview an independent sounding doctor by government/drug industry, because they want this independent sounding person to defend their product, when I did a search that I learned how to do pretty well online, or asked the person, they always acknowledged they were paid by the company. These people are financially connected. They're speaking as spokesmen, but they're being held out
Yeah.
by the media because the reporters don't ask, as if they're an independent authority on these topics. I think that's just another scandal.
Folks, head over to malice.locals.com, where Cheryl with an A will be taking questions exclusively from supporters. The book is called Follow the Science. It is out this week. I'm super excited to dig into this. Cheryl, running out of time, what has been your favorite part of this interview?
You, Michael, meeting you. I do mean that. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun to have a freewheeling conversation and to talk with someone who's informed on a lot of these topics. Because when you start from zero, I did in another interview, and he was very nice. He knew nothing of this world. And you do start to feel like he probably thinks I sound a little crazy. By
Yeah.
the end, he did say, wow, you are very well researched, and thank you. But it's fun to talk with somebody who's informed, and you've been discussing this and your eyes have been open to a lot of these facts. So it's a lot of fun to have a freewheeling conversation with you, Michael.
You are welcome.